The United States Supreme Court has issued a massive emergency ruling impacting a state election law issue and fundamental redistricting principles. In a high-stakes showdown over congressional redistricting and election laws, the Supreme Court officially granted an emergency application for a stay, instantly wiping out a lower court injunction and restoring the exact congressional map that Republicans wanted for the upcoming elections. But the real story did not end with just that emergency stay from the Supreme Court. The state has now also officially filed a petition for a writ of cert before judgment, asking the Supreme Court to bypass the 11th Circuit ruling and decide the case right here and now. This means that the state is not waiting around for years of additional litigation. Instead, the state is asking for the Supreme Court to permanently settle this legal question right here and now and really issue a landmark ruling on these whole Voting Rights Act issues, and this would impact a lot of states across the nation. So in this video, we're going to be breaking down the Supreme Court emergency ruling, the new cert petition that was filed, the questions now being presented to the High Court, and why this could become one of the most important election law cases in America. Now, before we jump into what is going on in this Supreme Court case, if you like this type of video and you want to make sure you get it going forward, make sure to subscribe to the channel and also turn on all notifications to never miss these videos when I release them. Now, to understand why this issue has now gone directly back to the Supreme Court, we first need to understand what happened in this case at the lower court level. Now, this entire dispute centers around congressional redistricting and a Supreme Court recent ruling and decision in a case called Louisiana versus Calais. Now, in the Calais case, the Supreme Court substantially clarified how federal courts are supposed to analyze vote dilution claims under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. The court emphasized that lower courts must properly separate race from politics, respect legitimate state districting goals, and avoid treating every political disagreement as evidence of racial discrimination. Now, following that Calais decision, the Supreme Court sent several redistricting cases and disputes back down to the lower courts for reconsideration under that updated framework. And one of those cases was this case here, which involves an Alabama redistricting battle over what type of map that could be used in following elections. But according to Alabama, instead of following the Supreme Court's instructions, the lower court largely repeated the same legal errors that the Supreme Court had already struck down. The district court once again blocked Alabama's 2023 congressional map and forced the state towards a court-drawn alternative that the court came up with itself. In response to that, Alabama immediately returned back to the Supreme Court on an emergency basis, and they sought an emergency stay from the Supreme Court. And the court responded by granting Alabama that request for an emergency stay, so they put an emergency stay on that lower court ruling. Now, when the Supreme Court granted Alabama's emergency stay, the majority did much more than just simply pause that lower court order. The Supreme Court specifically concluded that Alabama had demonstrated a strong likelihood of success on the merits. Now, that language is very critical. When the Supreme Court grants emergency relief and then also simultaneously indicates that a party is likely to prevail on the merits, it often provides a roadmap for how the court views this underlying case going forward. The court concluded that the lower court failed to properly apply Calais. In many ways, the majority there in that order said that the lower court outright defied what they said in that Supreme Court precedent. The Supreme Court found that the lower court failed to presume that Alabama's legislators acted in good faith. The court also concluded that the lower court improperly relied on alternative maps that did not satisfy Alabama's legitimate non-racial districting objectives, and those findings became the foundation for what happened in that order. Now, after Alabama got that emergency stay from the Supreme Court, there was a clear procedural sign that they would also seek a permanent win from the Supreme Court by seeking Supreme Court full review of the case. And that is now exactly what has happened. Alabama has officially filed a petition for a writ of cert before judgment. Now, I want to note right here and now that this is a highly unusual procedural move that Alabama is now doing. Normally, a case would proceed through the Court of Appeals before reaching the Supreme Court on the merits. But Alabama is asking the Supreme Court to skip the 11th Circuit entirely and resolve the dispute by itself right here and now. The state's argument is very straightforward. According to the petition, the lower court continued applying legal standards that conflict with the Calais framework. And, Alabama is arguing that the lower court just is outright defying the Supreme Court on multiple rulings already in this case. Alabama argues that further proceedings in the lower court is unnecessary because the Supreme Court has already provided the controlling framework, and the state is effectively telling the Supreme Court, you already answered these questions in Calais. The lower court ignored that guidance multiple times, and now the Supreme Court should step in on its own and correct the error directly on full review and just not simply wait for the 11th Circuit to get it wrong once again. Now, in this petition, Alabama returns multiple times to a central theme. Alabama argues that its 2023 map was designed to advance legitimate state objectives. According to the petition, the state sought to preserve the Gulf Coast communities of interest, keep together important geographic regions, protect incumbents by not pairing them together in certain jurisdictions, and avoid making race the dominant factor in redistricting decisions. Alabama argues that the district court improperly dismissed these goals in multiple rulings. The petition further argues that challengers never produced an alternative map that simultaneously satisfied all of Alabama's legitimate districting priorities. In Alabama's view, that failure should have been fatal under the Calais framework, but for whatever reason, the lower court continues to give the opposition a pass. What makes this case so significant is that this is not really just about Alabama alone. This dispute here could become a vehicle for answering much larger questions. For example, how much deference do states receive when drawing congressional districts? How should courts distinguish race from politics? When can federal courts override state redistricting decisions? And can states pursue traditional districting goals without automatically being accused of discrimination? Those are questions that affect election law disputes across the nation. And that is exactly why Alabama is seeking immediate Supreme Court review right here and now on this issue. The next major question is whether the Supreme Court will actually agree to hear this case, if they will accept that writ of cert before judgment here. If the court grants that cert before judgment, it would bypass the 11th Circuit and move directly to a full Supreme Court merits decision. That would dramatically accelerate the timeline in this case and on this issue. And given the language already used by the Supreme Court during that emergency stay request that was granted by the Supreme Court, Alabama believes very clearly that it has a strong chance of prevailing on this issue. If review is granted, the Supreme Court could use this case to further cement that Calais framework and provide additional guidance on the relationship between Voting Rights Act issues, state sovereignty, and constitutional limitations on race-based districting. So this legal battle began with Alabama's emergency stay victory, which has now entered an entirely new phase. The question now is whether the Supreme Court is willing to take this case immediately right here and now and issue a full merits review. So that is something that we're going to be watching going forward. The Supreme Court has already extended a response deadline for the opposition, but they are requesting a response from the opposition. So that is also going to come. And then we're going to see, upcoming in this term, which I believe starts in September, how the Supreme Court wants to proceed with this issue. But as we get more information, as it develops more, I will let you guys know. But let me know what you think down below about what the Supreme Court did initially with the emergency stay, the opposition that has happened, and kind of the defiance that has happened from the lower court, and if you think the Supreme Court is going to take this up and essentially issue a full decision on the merits. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comment section. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.